Hey Knights! So I'm going to be doing the next 3 chapter segment for Mermaid's Curse. So chapter 10, Numla, I think is how it's pronounced. Over the next week, Thorin found Amara's presence intoxicating and refreshing. Every evening before supper, she would disappear and then reappear by knocking on his door a few hours after supper. The young Mer had no idea what personal boundaries were, but for some reason Thorin didn't seem to mind. When she was around, nothing seemed to bother him. It was like he was in some sort of bubble, and the pair of them were the only ones allowed in. But then their class would end, and they would go their separate ways, and Thorin would most likely not see the girl until she came knocking the following day. However, today she hadn't come knocking. However, today she hadn't come knocking, and it was driving Thorin insane. He was pacing up and down in his chambers, stewing over the situation. He was annoyed that she was wasting his time, but also concerned and worried about what it was that was keeping her. His haughty temper was getting the best of him.
Lemonade!
Nice try. Repeating to himself, how dare she keep him waiting. He was offering her his help, a favor, and this is what she does. How rude of her, how inconsiderate and ungrateful of her. Eventually, he decided to go and find the girl himself. He turned on his heel, and with a final grunt, he stomped from his chambers, slamming the door unnecessarily hard. Amara had spent her evening with Lindar, as she usually did, while the rest of the dwarves had supper. But today she was in the zone. She had been reading aloud a particularly interesting book, and had continued to read even after Lindar had departed. She became so engrossed with her improving reading that time had simply slipped away from her, and it wasn't until Amara's ears picked up on a familiar thudding of boots that she remembered, and she looked up just as Thorin came into view. Noticing his expression and feeling his temper, she quickly scrambled up, quickly grabbing her book and hiding it behind her back in an attempt to hide from the dwarf. But she hadn't been quick enough. At first, Thorin was taken aback. Seeing her panic like that was not something he was used to, and it was not something he liked. The look of alarm didn't suit her, and it displeased him to think that he was the reason behind it. Her wide eyes and pursed lips were enough to make his fury drain a little, but he was still annoyed. Clearly she wasn't tied up in anything particular taxing, so she had no excuse to why she couldn't have come at least to tell him she wouldn't be available this evening. Amara stood awkwardly before him, a variety of strange noises sprouting from her. "You're late." His baritone voice echoed through the room, and Amara instantly fell silent. She paused, then whistled lowly, her head hanging. Thorin recognized this as her feeling guilty. She'd done it only 2 nights ago when she ate Keely's sticky bun and was later confronted about it by the young dwarf. "What are you hiding?" he asked. He'd seen her hide a book behind her back and took a few strides towards her. "Nothing," she mumbled, feeling acutely embarrassed. Thorin's temper rose a notch at her lying to him. He was already annoyed due to her wasting his time, and he certainly didn't appreciate being lied to. "Don't lie. What is that?" He continued to close the distance and stopped a meter from her. She finally looked up at him, her large golden eyes searching his face. She looked worried. "Promise you won't tell?" She fumbled with something behind her back, and Thorin nodded. Although he had reluctantly grown to care for the female, Lord Elrond's words hung over him like a storm cloud. Despite this thought, he watched with keen interest as she slowly revealed to him what she was hiding. "It's just a book?" Thorin raised his eyebrow, not understanding. Why would she feel the need to hide that? His gaze flickered to the desk where she'd been sat at. It was littered with books and papers, all of which were covered in messy, appalling handwriting and sketches. I can't read. The words fell from Amara's mouth surprisingly quickly, and it even caught her by surprise. The only people who knew of this were Bilbo and Lindar. You can't? Thorin nearly snorted, but quickly stopped himself when he quickly realized that this wasn't something to be taken lightly. Amara was clearly extremely embarrassed by this, and mocking her, he was sure would push her away into the grounds in which she'd never returned from. Well, I'm learning, she stuttered, holding the book close to her chest. Thorin noticed the large, bold picture on the front and instantly recognized it to be a children's book, although it was not one he knew of. Who's teaching you? Lindar, she replied, turning her attention back to the desk and quickly scrambling around, pushing the pages together. Thorin felt a pang of hurt at the fact that she hadn't come to him for help. Where is he? He asked, moving to help her clear up some of the papers but she stopped him, putting her small hand over his. He had to go, she replied, pushing Thorin's hand back to his side before getting back to work. Do you need any help? He offered, and the female paused, turning back to him and chewing her bottom lip. His anger had dissipated when she revealed what was obviously a secret to him. Instead, his rage was replaced by a triumphant feeling. She'd finally trusted him with information. It felt like a huge achievement and a massive step forward. No, she replied, turning back to the desk and shifting further through the papers. It was apparent now that she was looking for something. His triumphant bubble burst. No, Thorin scoffed, not used to the word. No, she repeated. She began flinging papers around, and Thorin couldn't help but notice some of the drawings. He wanted to have a closer look, but before he could, Amara had stopped making more of a mess and turned to him, her eyes large as ever. She no longer held her book protectively to her chest, but instead a blank piece of parchment. Or it was seemingly blank. The paper itself was a little disheveled and screwed up in places, clearly used. Thorin watched her expectantly as she emitted an array of high-pitched whistles, recognizing this as her mulling something over, her eyes flickering around his face. After a few moments, she seemingly made a decision, for she quickly extended her arm out, the piece of parchment still in her fingers, face down. When Thorin didn't take it, she waved it. For you. Slowly, Thorin took it, taking note that her skin had turned from a golden hue to a pale green, and her face looked nervous. Her brows were furrowed, and she chewed her bottom lip as she nodded her tiny hands into her dress worriedly. As soon as he took the piece of parchment, she pulled her hand away and wrung them together. Thorin brought his attention down to the parchment and turned it over. It took him a moment to process what was on it, and for a moment he was completely speechless. It was a drawing, but of him, with a small smile. The drawing was incredible, and it was obvious it had taken her a great deal of time, and that she'd put in a lot of effort. She paid expert attention to details that would even give Ori a run for his money. Everything was finely drawn, from each fine hair to a slight twinkle in his eyes, although he couldn't help but notice he was noseless. I didn't know how to draw your nose without being rude, she answered his thoughts, and he looked up at her, meeting her large eyes. He then did something she didn't expect him to do. He threw his head back and laughed, heartily and sincerely laughed. Amara smiled back at him, her golden hue returning, and she squeaked in surprise when Thorin closed the gap between them, and in one swift motion wrapped his arms around her and pulled her into a tight embrace, lifting her off the ground in the process. Once finished, he gently brought her back to earth and pulled away, smiling broadly when he noticed her skin was twinkling brighter than ever, and she was looking up and matching his expression. It's wonderful, thank you, he chuckled gently, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear. She continued to sparkle at him. I'm glad you like it, she replied, absent-mindedly nestling her face into his lingering hand. The pair stayed like that for a long moment before Amara finally pulled away and once again started busying herself with the scattered papers, this time organizing them. What are these? Thorin asked, pointing towards a certain growing stack of papers. Once he'd folded the drawing and tucked it into his breast pocket. Amara paused and followed his fingers toward the paper gingerly, and she reached forward to pick them up. There are a list of words I don't understand, she replied, flicking through the papers. Do you want me to decipher them for you? Thorin offered. Amara seemed to mull his proposal over, obviously hesitant about letting him in. But eventually, and rather reluctantly, she nodded. Thorin took the list from her and took a seat, reading through the list as Amara began shuffling around again. There wasn't as many words as he thought. As many of them were scribbled out, her handwriting was rather large, and a few of them weren't actually legible. Once Amara had finished pottering about, she took a seat next to Thorin and scooted her chair closer to him, once again having a total disregard for personal space. But the dwarf didn't mind, and instead he found himself leaning towards her slightly. He cleared his throat and began to work his way down the list, having no difficulty with any of them himself, but understanding why she would be unable to read or identify them. Halfway down the third page, he paused, glancing up at Amara, who wore a face of complete concentration as she absorbed his words. He took her in for a long moment, appreciating how hard exactly she was trying to learn and respecting her for it. But it was the word that he had paused on, not her. Love, he read, watching as her expression changed. I can read that one, she began, standing up and reaching for her book. It is repeated time and time again in here. It is repeated time and time again in here. It sounds wonderful. She began flicking through the pages. That's why I've completely forgot about our meeting. She smiled shyly. I was reading about this wonderful thing, but I don't entirely understand what it is. It seems to make humans do stupid things, but they like it. Her referring to people as humans was a harsh reminder to Thorin how foreign she was. Thorin thought long and hard for a moment before finally replying, It's indestructible. But why? Amara urged, growing frustrated. It seems like this extremely important thing, but no matter how much I search, no one seems to have an answer to why it exists. I suppose there isn't a reason per se, but it makes people stronger, it brings people together. But here, Amara flipped through the book hastily. Here it tears people apart. Here it sounds horrible, and this person is so weak as if they want to die. Why do humans do it? Amara pointed at a passage, but didn't give Thorin a chance to read it before she was off again, searching for more. It's not only humans that do it, Thorin began, catching Amara's attention. Dwarves do it too, and elves. How silly, she muttered, going back to her searching. And mermaids, I believe, he continued, instantly captivating her attention this time. She lowered her book and blinked at him. Really? Thorin nodded. Love is the most beautiful thing two people can do. For us dwarves, it is rare. But it is an unbreakable bond between two halves. What is it, though? Why can it hurt people so much, yet bring them so much joy? It's a deep feeling of affection, he replied. When you care about someone so deeply, sometimes they do things that can hurt you. Like what? Thorin shrugged. If you love someone deep enough, seeing them love another would hurt. Something sparked in her eyes. Have you ever been in love? No, Thorin replied briskly. Dwarves only love once, and very rarely do they. But you're a king, she replied, taking her book again. You must have a queen. Look, it says here. She pointed to where the words king and queen sat side by side. Maybe one day I will, he replied, watching her with amusement as she folded page corners over and scribbled on parchment. Suddenly something clicked in his head. That reminds me. He caught her attention again. He paused, trying to remember how the words had slipped from his mind. Despite how many long hours mulling over them. What does tu nom l'am mean? Amara seemed surprised for a moment. How did you learn that? Thorin didn't know how to answer that and scratched his beard. I thought I read it somewhere. Why? Well, it means I love you. She quickly busied herself again with papers. Thorin smirked. Can you teach me more of the ways of your people? I know you know more about them than you let on, he added. Amara sank back into her seat slowly. What do you want to know? I would like to. Why do you want to know? I would like to. You interest me. Her eyebrows rose then, and he couldn't help but notice she glowed a little brighter. I may know more than nothing, but it's still not a lot. What happened exactly? He asked, referring to her past, and instantly he knew he'd overstepped the line, for her glowing instantly ceased. I'm sorry, No, it's okay. Her glowing started back up, but only dim this time. She seemed to be mulling something over again. You say love is a deep feeling of affection. I'm gonna sneeze, I can feel it. You say love is a deep feeling of affection. Thorn nodded, a little confused. How so? Thorn quickly realized that she may be using this as a trust exercise, him giving her precious information exchanged for hers. So he went along with it. When you love someone, you wish the best for them, no matter what, he began, watching her as she shuffled around in her seat, even if that means letting yourself get hurt. But why? Amara frowned, obviously not grasping the idea of throwing yourself into the fire for someone else. Thorn shrugged. You just want them to be happy, safe, and well. You put their well-being before your own. Your feelings run so deep for them, you wish to spend the rest of your life with that person. You don't want anyone else to have them. It is the feeling of needing that person to survive, because without them, you feel as though you'll die. Without them, your life is not worth living. How do you know so much about love if you've never felt it yourself? Amara asked, peering at him slightly. I know of it, I see it, hear of it, and read about it, Thorn replied. Do you want love? She asked. Thorn thought for a moment. No, but why? It may be strength, but it's also a weakness. I have more important things to worry about. Thorn paused for a moment, making another whistling sound of contemplation. Thorn waited for her to speak. And a crush? She asked. A crush? Yes, a crush. What is the difference between having a crush and love? Thorn was surprised. The word crush was a common sort, very informal, and only used amongst dwarflings light-heartedly. He was considering how she'd come across such a word. A crush is a brief infatuation with someone, a lower scale of love. Love is stronger, more developed, and more serious. He frowned at her as she made another whistle of contemplation. Where did you read about crushes? The word alone made him cringe. I didn't, Amara replied, suddenly cheery. Where did you hear of it, then? He asked, expecting her to say Kiwi. Bilbo. You have a crush on Bilbo? Thorn choked and puffed out his chest. The water dweller simply laughed. No, of course not. Then why did he bring it up? He said I have a crush on you, she replied as if it was nothing and shrugged, but Thorn stiffened. Why would he say that? Thorn's voice was visibly hoarse. Amara turned her attention back to him, then, feeling his sudden unease hit her like a heavy wave. Have I made you insecure? She mocked, and suddenly Thorn felt naked before her. No, he scoffed, folding his arms over his chest defensively. Amara laughed, flashing her sharp teeth. Don't worry, if it's just a brief infatuation, then I'm sure it'll pass. For some reason, this didn't make Thorn feel any better. In fact, it made him feel worse. Chapter 11. Goodbyes. Tonight was the night that the dwarves' map was supposed to be deciphered by Lord Elrond, and if all goes well, then they will be leaving in the early hours of the next morning. That was the plan anyways, but there was one last thing to decide. It had been nearly another 2 weeks since Amara gave Thorn the drawing, and since then he'd seen her every night without fail, and he'd even seen her once or twice during the day as well. She taught him more about her culture, although Thorn doubted it was everything she knew, but he quickly discovered that if she didn't want to talk about something, she wouldn't. Stubborn wouldn't even begin to describe how she'd be, for if Thorn insisted on something, she would start to ignore him and pretend he wasn't there, which was infuriating nonetheless. However, after storming off one night after one of these situations where she pretended he didn't exist, he bumped into Bilbo. The poor hobbit was nearly bowled over by the storming dwarf and hurried after him to try and cool him off. They hadn't spoken for long, but by the end of the conversation, Thorn's anger had evaporated, instead been replaced by a winning feeling upon learning that he knew more about Amara than Bilbo did. Amara had opened up to him more than she had to Bilbo. He was over the moon. He would no longer deny that he did indeed have a soft spot for her, even if she was infuriating some of the time. But she was also kind, funny, and eager to listen to whatever he had to say. She absorbed everything like a sponge and seemed to have a genuine interest in the whole of the company. Her behavior made him question Lord Elrond's words about mermaids, for although she seemed in her own little world most of the time, she was far from unfeeling. Thorn had been trying his hardest not to think about the road ahead, which would undoubtedly be without her. They'd all grow so used to her bubbly presence that when she wasn't there, it seemed painfully silent, even when Keeley was about. "Have you made a decision yet?" Thorn turned to his left to find Balin standing beside him. He'd been too deep in thought to even notice his approach. "About what?" he asked, turning back to look out over the valley. Down below him on the grass was Amara and Bilbo, and Thorn kept one eye on them. "A particular golden-haired female," Balin responded. "I can't imagine you want her to stay here with the elves." The white-haired dwarf let out a sigh, and there was a brief pause before he chuckled to himself. Thorn raised an eyebrow at Balin before the dwarf continued. "Actually, I do not think she especially wants to stay here either." "Oh?" Thorn questioned, feeling a little smug. "Aye, Keeley overheard her telling Bilbo that she found the elves, well, a little dull." Thorn snorted a laugh, and Balin chuckled again. "She mentioned they were no fun," Thorn agreed, remembering how a few nights ago he'd found Amara sulking over her book, and when he asked what bothered her, she told him how Lindar wouldn't dance with her. He, of course, didn't mention that he also didn't dance out of choice. There was another pause before Thorn broke it, finally answering Balin's question. "But I have indeed been thinking about it." He waited for an acknowledgement from Balin, and when he did, Thorn continued. "I will send word to Ered Mithrin asking for them to come here and escort her back. Once we have reclaimed Erenbor, I will go and collect and bring her back myself." Balin nodded. "Do you not think that this may be an advantage over Smaug to have a water dweller in our presence?" "How so?" Thorn was aware that she was a particularly skilled fighter, but no more than the rest of them. "Also, this quest has been dangerous so far, and will no doubt get worse." Thorn couldn't even bring himself to imagine how he would feel if Amara was to get hurt, or even killed. "Well, you know her better than I, but their magic is supposed to be most impressive. I'd assume she would be able to bend water." Thorn frowned, watching Amara as she blew a dandelion right at Bilbo. She has never made mention of it. In fact, she didn't speak much about the waters at all to him. Usually her conversations revolved around the company. "Well, maybe it is just folklore, then," Balin replied, sensing Thorn's tone. "Has she agreed to this?" "I have yet to tell her. I plan to do so tonight," Thorn responded. "I'm sure our kin will take good care of her in the Grey Mountains." "Aye," agreed Balin, "although I would note to add to warn them on her sweet tooth. I hear she's already half a bag of sugar today." Thorn smirked. "But it's barely noon," he replied, and Balin simply chuckled again. "It was only this morning I saw her wrestling with Keeley over a scone." "Best not introduce her to chocolate, then," Balin added with another chuckle. Thorn agreed seriously. Amara didn't want to play the harp that night, nor did she want to read. She felt sick. Up until now, she'd been doing well. Every night she learned a bit of harp, and then once she grew bored of that, Thorn would help her with her reading, and he would usually stay in her company until well into the night. But tonight she wasn't feeling up for it, having just eaten an entire, heavily iced cake. So instead, she slowly wadded to Thorn's chamber like every night, cradling her favorite book under her right arm, with the intentions of asking him to read to her, rather than the other way around. She eventually arrived at her destination and knocked twice on the wooden door before taking a step back and patiently waiting. The door opened to reveal a rather disgruntled-looking Thorn. Instantly Amara frowned. "What's the matter?" she asked, letting her book slip slightly. "Nothing," he lied, and went to take a step forward to leave with her, but Amara was too quick. Before Thorn had time to blink, she'd slipped under his arm that was still resting on the open door, and toddled over toward his made bed, and wordlessly slipped under the covers. Amara simply blinked at Thorn expectantly as he still stood in the doorway with what would be a blank expression, if it wasn't for his slightly raised eyebrows. "What are you doing?" he finally asked, watching Amara wiggle around, partially submerged in the covers. "Getting comfortable," she replied casually. "Your bed is far more comfortable than mine," she noted, more to herself than him. "Why?" Thorn gingerly stepped away from the door, leaving it slightly ajar and feeling completely improper and tense about the female lounging in his bed. "Because," Amara replied overdramatically, "I've eaten an entire cake, and now I'm full and totally uncomfortable." She absentmindedly rubbed her belly. It was awkwardly bloated and causing her discomfort. "And the book?" Thorn questioned, eyeing the children's book that was left abandoned on the other side of the bed. Amara grinned at him then. I'd rather like you to read to me, although I may fall asleep, so I apologize in advance. The look that graced her face didn't look even remotely sorry at the idea. Thorin took another few strides into the room to stand at the foot of the bed, arms folded over his chest and a frown on his face. Amara wasn't paying attention now. Instead, she was busying herself with her book, flicking through the pages to find where they last left off. I heard you're leaving in the morning, Amara suddenly said, glancing up at Thorin from her spot in bed. She dropped the book and turned around to fluff one of the pillows up. Thorin leant against the foot of the bed, averting his eyes to her left and staring intently at the suddenly interesting nightstand. On her way toward the beds, Amara had blown out the small candle that sat there, leaving it emit a thin stream of smoke. Not that he was surprised by this. Whenever the female saw a candle, she blew it out, even if it was one someone had just lit. You heard correctly, he finally answered, making sure not to catch her gaze with his own. Are you going to join me? She asked after a long pause, clearly not understanding how improper such a move would be. Thorin wasted a good moment to reply, and Amara waited patiently, as she always did. You know, you never told me what happened. With what? Amira was peering at him now, a slight frown on her face. With your kin, Thorin replied lowly, finally meeting her gaze. Amara seemed to understand. What is it you want to know exactly? How old are you? You seem to know a lot about one thing, but nothing of another. He was referring to her vast knowledge of fighting, but nothing else to do with land. Amara thought long and hard for a moment, her fingers quickly moving as if counting something. I'm 385. And how do you mean? Thorin was taken back for a moment at her age. How long do mermaids live? And how do you know how to fight? As long as necessary. And myself. Her tone was already beginning to flatten, obviously growing bored of the conversation. And Thorin knew he didn't have much time until she completely lost interest and ignored him. How did you end up in those caves? Thorin asked, leaning more of his weight against the bed. My mother brought me there with my sister. There was a war, and I can't remember it. I was only a few dozen seasons old. Sister? She had never spoken of her family, nor had Bilbo ever mentioned anything of it. But with that, Amara closed her mouth and averted her eyes away from Thorin, suddenly taking her interest to the book again. Making that the conversation was obviously over, Thorin sighed. He'd been hoping to ask her more about the jewels that glistened in the faint light, laying nestled neatly on her chest. Clearly, these questions would have to wait for another night. I'll miss you. She suddenly spoke through the silence. Thorin looked back up to find her watching him with concern on her face and a tinge of sadness in her eyes. All of you. It will not be long before you see us again, I'm sure. I have sent word to my kin in the Grey Mountains to come and meet you and take you to stay with them until we have reclaimed the mountain. Amara's concern changed to confusion. What? Take me back? Yes, take you back to stay in their halls until Arnborn's safe. When it is, I will personally come and collect you. Yes? Amara's brow furrowed further. No. 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 Thorin mirrored her furrowed brow in confusion. I'm not leaving you here. I'm not planning to stay here, she responded, her indifferent persona being somewhat infuriating to Thorin as his anger ticked away. She would never elaborate on anything, and always state what was only necessary. Then where are you going? Thorin straightened up from slouching on the bed frame and came to stand beside her, looming down at her. Why, home, of course. Lord Elrond told me I can follow the river Brian right down to the ocean. She stopped frowning and smiled. Thorin's stomach dropped like a lead weight. Suddenly, an earthly feeling that felt like a mixture of betrayal and someone plunging a knife through his chest came over him. The thought that Lord Elrond was indeed right dawned on him. She was deceitful. He had fallen into her cunning trap and believed that she did in fact care for the company. That she did in fact care for him. It made him sick to his stomach, realizing that he had been fooled by her. He genuinely believed she cared for every single one of them, but in fact, she had no feelings for them at all. At the end of the day, it was only herself that she cared for. She had no loyalty to them, to him. After all this time, she was still going to turn her back on them, and this made him angry. After all this time, she was still going to leave them. Amara continued to smile up at the dwarf, and her expression didn't fade until Thorin took a step back. Instantly, Amara sensed his mood and quickly got out of the bed, her frown returning. What's wrong? You, Thorin hissed. We trusted you. Amara looked as alarmed as she felt. Her heart was racing, and her stomach felt sicker than ever. Thorin, she began, trying to take a step forward and reaching out for the dwarf, but he dodged her, his expression menacing. You are indeed the most cunning, vile creature I have ever encountered. His anger had completely engulfed him, fueled by betrayal and something that felt a lot like his heart had been ripped from his chest. In hindsight, he was totally overreacting, but at the moment he was too blind to accept what was feeding his fury. Amara looked horrified, her mouth hung half agape, and her eyes were wide with confusion and fear. What? It had escalated too quickly, even for her. She didn't understand. You have no loyalty to anyone but yourself, Thorin continued, his voice raising and pointing an accusing finger at the girl. After everything, you choose to just leave? His emotions were getting the better of him. If it were anyone else, he would not have acted this way. He would have understood, but this was Amara. Amara, in turn, had turned her sickly green, and her heart was beating unusually fast. Thorin, what are you talking about? Of course I have loyalty to you, but that out there is my home. She pointed a shaking figure out towards the valley, where the springs tunneled down and met the river. Thorin was silent for a moment more, his breathing heavy and his fists clenched. He was undoubtedly hurt, but why, he wasn't sure. He generally thought she'd stay with him. Get out. His voice was lower than usual, and rumbled through the dead silent room. Thorin? Amara reached for him again, her eyes glassy. Thorin flinched away, not meeting eyes with her. I said, get out. And Amara did, fleeing straight past him and silently slipping out of the slightly open door. Thorin glared down at the book she left on the bed, her favorite book. Where's Amara? Bilbo asked, still blinking sleep away from his eyes. It was still early, too early even, but at least he wasn't the only one who thought so. Many of the dwarves were muttering their complaints about the early start to one another. All except Thorin, of course, who trekked on ahead of everybody else. His storm cloud was once again positioned over his head, and the company tried to avoid him as best they could. This morning, having witnessed him already lay into Ori over simply dropping a bowl, something was clearly bothering him, but no one dared ask what. She's not coming, tried Balin from behind Thorin, glancing back at the hobbit with pursed lips. Nor is she ever, grunted Thorin, much to everyone's surprise. What? No, I mean, where was she? I want to say goodbye to her this morning, but she wasn't in her chamber. Nor anywhere else, replied Bilbo, yelping when he tripped over a yak. In his momentary lack of attention, he missed the somber look Balin watched Thorin with, and the obvious tension of the raven-haired dwarf's shoulders. It had been several weeks after the company had stepped over into the wild, and in all that time, Thorin had barely said a word to anyone. Even his nephews were kept in the dark about what the dwarf was silently brooding about, more so than usual. Did Amara draw that? A quiet voice whispered over Thorin's shoulder, and the dwarf silently cursed the hobbit for being so silent. It was late, and to be Thorin's watch was apparently Bilbo, who was hovering around as well. Yes, Thorin grunted in response. Did she draw you one too? He carefully folded the drawing back up and put it safely back in his pocket. It was the only reminder of her he had left. No, replied Bilbo, taking a seat beside Thorin. Do you miss her as well? Thorin didn't reply, but the truth was he did. She was on his mind most of the day. She really liked you, you know, Bilbo continued, looking out over the cliff, on which they were sleeping. Again, Thorin didn't reply. She gave you a gift. I don't think you understand what that means to her. Her feelings were fake, Thorin replied coldly. No, they weren't. Why do you think that? After everything, she still went home. She still left us. Bilbo thought for a moment. You have built you and your people a whole new home in the Blue Mountains, have you not? But after all that, you still want to return home? That is different. No, it's not. Bilbo turned to Thorin then, almost surprised to catch a glimpse of sadness in his eyes. There was a long pause, and Bilbo was about to get up and leave the Thorin to his musings when he spoke. Do you think we'll ever see her again? His voice was totally flat, without emotion. Bilbo's shoulders sunk. Honestly, I don't know. He turned away then, and Miss Thorin put his head in his hands. Chapter 12. Unbreakable Promise. Amara was angry, hurt, and devastated all at the same time. It had been weeks since her departure from Rivendell, but nonetheless, her emotions continued to fester and corrupt her. She no longer shimmered like thousands of tiny diamonds in the sunlight. Her eyes were no longer irresistible golden orbs, and her tail no longer bore an arrangement of alluring gold scales. She was broken, damaged by the words and actions of a certain dwarf king. His words hung over her like a storm cloud, and as a result, she was weakened. Her tail had whole scales missing, which she kept in her bag, and no longer resembled liquid gold when she moved. And instead, her tail had dulled to a pale greeny blue, and each one of her remaining scales had gone soft and started to peel. Her skin was burning hot to the touch, completely polar from what a cold-blooded creature should be, and was pale. Nauseous orange color. The sort of pale orange what makes you squirm and gag at the sight of it. She no longer shone, and her eyes were no longer enthralling. Instead, they were empty pits of black. Her hair was dull and unkempt, grubby and slightly matted in places. Needless to say, she was very ill, and wept regularly. A crying mermaid is a bad omen, and every tear that left her eye would roll down her cheek and harden into droplets of a glass-like substance of blue or green. She thought often of the company, praying that they were safe and well, but cursing their leader at the same time. Amara didn't know much about love and friendship, but from what she read in her small amount of time on land, she was suffering from heartbreak. She knew this, but wasn't entirely sure why. The truth was, and although she refused to make the connection, she missed Thorn the most. She missed the one creature that hurt her the most. When you care about someone so deeply, sometimes they do things that can hurt you. Thorn's words plagued her thoughts. Her head was a mess. She didn't understand, and the harder she thought, the more she cried. She missed him dearly, but he hurt her so much, and yet at the same time she wanted to be near him, be around him, have him laugh and pick her up like he did when she drew him a picture. But she could be more stubborn than a dwarf, and refused to let herself fall into what was undoubtedly a snare for emotion. Every day she hurt more and more, and she knew her end was coming. However, she knew why it was taking her so long to die, and that was because she made a promise to protect Phoebe and Keeley, and that sort of promise was not something mermaids did lightly. She had a commitment to the pair. She was unable to just let that go. As a result, she knew her death would be a slow and most certainly a painful one. It wasn't every day you get chased out of a cave network by goblins, nor is it that you are taken in the jaws of a rog and live to tell the tale. That night on Car Rock, Thorn spent most of the night thinking about Amara. He wished dearly that she was there with him. He sat facing the lonely mountain. In his mind, he imagined she was sitting next to him, yakking away about nonsense. If she was there, he'd tell her about the goblins. He'd tell her about the pale orc, and he was sure she'd find the idea of giant eagle simply wonderful. He imagined the way her eyes would light up at the mention of something new, and the way she'd stick her tongue out a little as she concentrated on listening. He imagined her laughing and grinning at him, and he imagined that when he'd tell her about his near-death experience, that she would be upset. He imagined her inner light would blow out, and her dainty frown would grace her features. But then he'd hold her close and watch as she lit back up and smiled up at him. However, of course, that was just his imagination. It wasn't until their absence was really set in stone to Thorin that he realized just how much she had meant to him. It was nighttime, and Amara sat upon a large rock, about 100 meters from the shore. She was basking in the moonlight. Not that it was replenishing as it used to be. She was playing with her assortment of possessions, the ones she kept in the bag Laura had given her upon her departure. Everything was lined out along the rock, and she was busy organizing them. Not that there were many. She scratched at her itching tail and sighed when she felt one of the scales dislodge and loosen. With a slight frown, she drew her attention to it, pulling at it and wiggling it a little like a loose tooth. With a quiet yelp, the scale slipped free, and Amara's slight frown turned into a full-blown scowl. She added the scale to her ever-growing collection that was neatly stacked on the rock, and sighed again. Her possessions consisted of several pebbles, all in a variety of size and extraordinary colors, each equally beautiful. She also had her brush that she had taken from Rivendell, alongside a matching hand mirror. The salt water had done the silver no favors, however, and even though it had been only several months, it was beginning to tarnish. She also had several pieces of poultry, mainly teaspoons, which were her favorite, a piece of pink ribbon, a few pairs of trousers, again Lord Elrond had advised her to carry some, a pair of shoes, and Thorn's whetstone, which she'd stolen from him. Slowly she reached for the whetstone, picking it up and running her thumb over the indentions on it. Something in her heart fluttered at the thought that this was once Thorn's, even though she was still angry and upset with him. She sighed again and fell back against the rock, holding the whetstone close to her chest. She looked up at the moon and stars above her. She couldn't help but wonder if Thorn was somewhere looking up at them too. Unfortunately, that night he wasn't. He had looked up at the stars every single night since the company's departure from Rivendell, and this was the first night he was unable to due to the thick, dense, and intoxicating canopy above him. It was their first night within the Mirkwood Forest, and within hours of being within the borders, he and everyone else understood why it came to bear that name. But Mark was an understatement to how the reality of the forest actually was. Everywhere you looked, something darted around in the corner of your eye, and when you turned to look again, it would vanish away, leaving only a trail of disturbed foliage in its wake. It was disorienting, and when you walked, there was a constant itch on your back, as if hundreds of tiny eyes were beating into you. But the source was never anywhere to be found. It brought terror to every member of the company, whether they showed it or not. They were scared of what lurked in the shadows, what dwelled in the unknown. There was no way to relax in the forest, and within hours everyone was exhausted from having to be on constant alert. Even when sleep was offered, only a few took it, and those who didn't had restless slumber and were plagued with nightmares. The air in the forest was like poison, and the more of it you inhaled, the more tainted your mind would become. Already, the company had fallen into numerous predicaments due to its intoxicating effect. Thorn knew most of the company were awake, a few were pottering around, but he knew even more were just lying still and silent. The dwarf rolled the sword over on his lap and ran his hand over the flat, cool surface. He was pleased to find it was still sharp, not that it would blow up particularly easily or quickly. Nevertheless, he missed the comfort of his whetstone would give him, an emotional outlet of sort, but he had no idea where it had gone. He had an inkling he must have left it in Goblin Town, but even the weeks before that he couldn't find it, and he hated to think he left such a thing at Rivendell. While thinking of the whetstone, his thoughts eventually trailed back to Mara. For the first time in what felt like days, just the thought of her lightened his mood, just a smidge, and her memory somehow gave him more purpose. He hadn't thought about her recently, having his mind reoccupied by other thoughts, and his miserable brooding about having to travel through Mirkwood had ticked away at him. Time. His miserable brooding about having to travel through Mirkwood has ticked away at him. Oh, overtime. Okay, missing a word. By now he made a mental note to think of her often, as she spurred him on. Amara was lying on the beach and staring up the sky, watching the clouds drift past. It was about midday, and the female was actually the most content she'd felt in months, having previously been plagued by misery, but now the sun was just brightly shining, and she was indulging herself in its warmth. She dug her fingers and her toes into the soft sand of the shore, sighing pleasantly at the feeling. She'd given up on her tail for days, as the sight of it made her feel even worse. Not that her legs were much better. Coated in cracked and peeling skin wasn't exactly the nicest sight, but it wasn't as painful. Not only had she given up her tail, but she'd also given up her search for her kin. But not because she couldn't find them, because it dawned on her that she and her sister were left in the caves for safety. And even when the war was over and the waters were safe again, according to Lord Elrond, no one had come to find them. No one had bothered to collect them. Why would she want to be part of that? Why should she, after all this time, go and search for them and ask to be accepted by them? She didn't want to be involved with such heartless creatures who forgot about her and her sibling. Realizing all this, however, had pulled out on her heartstrings, and even harder when she recognized her true feelings for the company. In truth, she wanted to be with them more than her own race. She liked the company of dwarves, a hobbit, and a wizard far more than the idea of her own kin. Thorn Oakenshield was pacing up and down, throwing the occasional punch at the wall of his cell. It had been several weeks since being captured by the Mirkwood elves, and time was very painfully eating away. He was waiting on Bilbo to show up and deliver the past day's events. Not that it would change much. There was no step closer to escaping now, when they were first thrown into these cells. The dwarves were angry for a number of reasons, the first being that they were stuck in here with no way out. The second, that they were in fact were captured for no factual reason and held on no real grounds. And Thandril had no right to keep them there. The third was he and his kin had been captured by elves, and the humiliation was getting the better of him. There is also the fact that Dorn's day was fast approaching, and with no obvious route of escape, they will miss it. They could well miss it. Although, the more apparent it became that they were stuck in these cells for good, the more it hit home that he may never see Amara again. "I think I have a plan," a voice whispered excitedly, and Thorin turned to find Bilbo standing there, grinning broadly from ear to ear, bobbing slightly with joy. Thorin strode the short distance to his cell. "His cell door. Pray tell," he inquired, his voice raspy and rumbling. "There is a feast in a few nights' time. I think then will be our chance to escape, as all the elves will be too preoccupied with their festivities to notice us," Bilbo exclaimed, his grin never faltering. Thorin leant against his cell and barely displayed a smile of appreciation. "Good, then we will seize our chance." Amara was picking her scales again, and even though she knew it was only making it worse, however, she was in a lot of pain, and it was the only way to relieve that was to itch, scratch, and pull at the irritating scales, which would eventually lead to it coming out and resulting in even more pain. But that was a future problem, and not yet worth worrying about in her eyes. It was nearly dusk, and the sun was casting an orange glow over the waters before the mermaid, who sat in the shallow waters on the shore. She'd spent the majority of the day on the beach with legs, which she'd been doing a lot of recently. It seemed that at that moment she spent more times with legs than a tail, simply because it reminded her of being with the company. Having legs made her feel as though she was one of them again, and she missed them dearly. Often she found herself imagining that they were all there with her, and she would instantly perk up. But when she turned around to find herself alone, her mood dampened again. It wasn't until the sun was just about to disappear below the horizon when something dreadful washed over her. She stopped mid-scale wiggle and blinked, her gut wrenching and her heart racing. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Something in her chest began to pull northeast, and she knew instantly what was going on. It was what she had been begging the gods for months not to let happen. It was what had been plaguing her thoughts and fearing most of all. Without even a second thought, she pushed away from the shore, heading straight towards where Fili and Kili were undoubtedly in danger. "Kili? Kili?" Fili was yelling out hysterically to his brother, eyes filled with horror as he watched helplessly as Kili fell to the ground, withering in pain. Thorin heard the chaos and turned, unable to do anything, also, as he was pressed up against the shutter water gates. Within seconds, all anarchy broke loose. Elves appeared out of nowhere, and further orcs began to swarm them. Fili tried desperately to get his brother, but to no avail. Kili was injured, and both Fili and Thorin were unable to do anything about it. Kili, with a cry of pain, pulled himself up off the ground, barely dodging an orc as it went tumbling over the side and into the water, a knife protruding from his back. With his last strength and another cry, he dropped his weight down upon the lever. Within moments, the gates swung open and the doors began to sweep away by the fast-flowing water. Thorin had used enough time to glance back over his shoulder to see Kili fall into a passing drown before he, too, was rushed down a rolling waterfall. The scene that unfolded over the next few minutes was total mayhem. Orcs pursued the doors wildly, and the elves followed, more concerned about the invading orcs than the escaping dwarves. Thorin tried desperately to get hold of a weapon, and managed to grab one off an orc as it fell into the water. Just as he did, an orc jumped at him, but he was prepared, and with one harsh swing, he struck the orc straight in the face. The creature fell into water with a large splash, and instantly Thorin swung around. "Dalin!" he yelled, and followed by throwing the club to the bald dwarf. Instantly, Dalin caught it and threw it, taking a swing at another orc that made a jump for him before passing it on himself. Thorin turned back to the front, gritting his teeth in anger when he saw an upcoming fallen tree. The tree was over the river, and subsequently a small band of orcs had used it to bridge to gain advantage, positioning themselves right over the river and readying themselves to attack any dwarf that sailed beneath them, which they all would. Completely defenseless, Thorin braced himself when in the middle of the tree, orcs pulled out a bow and reached behind him for an arrow, making his aim straight for Thorin. Thorin drew closer, preparing to jump from his barrel at any moment and away from the firing line, and the orc looked as though he was about to let the arrow fly. However, the orc never did, for from the water shot a blur of blue and strange sickly orange-colored object. The creature hissed loudly and twisted itself, taking the dim-witted orcs by surprise and drawing back its tail, smacking into the trio with full force. All four creatures fell into the water with a hard splash. Okay, so that's the next 3 chapters. Alrighty. Peace out, knights.